Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So, the presentation and topic that I chose to discuss was the question: do you agree with the assertion that freedom of speech on the internet implies our freedom to troll one another? So, an overview of this presentation will argue that freedom of speech on the internet implies our freedom to troll one another to a certain extent. And within this presentation, to get to the conclusion, I aim to discuss the role of harm in free speech using Mill's harm principle and Ash's 10 principles, the aspect of trolling and free speech, the good and bads of the both, and then the conclusion. So, when it comes to defining trolling and free speech, so the word trolling, when looking at the Cambridge Dictionary 2019, trolling is defined as someone who leaves an intentionally annoying message on the internet in order to get attention or cause trouble. A message that someone leaves on the internet that is intended to annoy people, and also a well-constructed troll will provoke irate or confused responses from flamers and newbies. When looking at the definition of freedom of speech from dictionary.com 2019, that is the power or right to express one's opinions without censorship, restraint, or legal penalty. To begin with the argument that freedom of speech on the internet implies our freedom to troll one another, it's helpful to look at John Stuart Mill's harm principle. And he wrote this in his book on liberty, that the principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action or any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. So, as the internet wasn't really around when Mill created the harm principle, you can sort of get the gist that he supports the idea that freedom of speech implies our freedom to troll one another, say if the internet was around back then. He reiterates the fact that society should allow us to do whatever and has no right to stop us unless it's causing physical harm. In another aspect, that basically means that we cannot really stop someone doing something if it merely offends people, as that is a limited means of harm. It's probably better to be offended and be unhappy rather than to not be free, as that would make you unhappier. A typical Millian would argue that hate speech is allowable and that there should be no limits to self-expression. However, some could argue that sometimes it can cause more psychological harm to an individual to hold something in, and that could later result in physical harm. Say, for example, if there was a restriction on being able to express how you feel, and say if a person went out onto the street and came face to face with something that they don't agree with or they don't particularly like, and say that resulted in an act of violence just due to that built-in frustration that's been built in for so long, that it's probably better to be able to express yourself and have that right to express how you feel, whether you hate something, whether you don't agree with something, or whether something makes you uncomfortable, rather than having to bottle something in and later that could result into violent outbursts or series of just creating more hate in the world. Um, Another thing to also look at is Ash's 10 principles. Now, that's Timothy Garton Ash, and he has 10 principles of free speech. The first being that we, all human beings, must be free and able to express ourselves and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas, regardless of frontiers. However, China and North Korea don't really cooperate with that, as for example, China has Facebook blocked and its own Google server, and North Korea has a limited internet to only allow government influence. And so that creates the fact that how can people have the right to say how they feel if they're not being that they're not having that access to be able to do so? The second principle of Ash's 10 principles is that we neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. So that basically means that one can be offended from a threat, but a threat of violence is different and should be considered as harm simply because you are imposing that you may harm somebody physically, or you are wanting somebody to harm themselves physically, and so that can be considered as physical harm when referring to John Stuart Mill's principle. An example of this is shown where nearly 50% of women working in European parliaments have received violent threats, and this is an ongoing discussion today, especially in the British Parliament. The IPU president, Gabriela Cuevas, said that not only is harassment a severe infringement of women's rights, it's also bad for democracy, and we need to acknowledge the perverse effect that this can have on the freedom of action of women MPs. This sort of relates into the conversation of having deliberative democracy based when it comes to free speech, simply because free speech shouldn't be restricted, but there should be some ground rules placed in order for us to have these debates live and ongoing, and still to have them continuing as they are an essential part of living and breathing in a democracy. However, when it comes to stuff where harassment and death threats and abuse are being interviewed, that's where ground rules should be placed, and that should be the only restriction, and that's why freedom of speech should be allowed to have the freedom to troll one another, but to a certain extent. As soon as it implies the implement to hurt somebody or impose a death threat, then that's when it should be restricted, and that's when those rules should apply. Another important principle of Ash's is that we require uncensored, diverse, trustworthy media so we can make well-informed decisions and participate fully in political life. And the sixth principle also has importance, and that is respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. And that is where we should be able to respect something that someone says due to their belief. An example of this, is Jabbar Salvan in 2011 in Azerbaijan. So what happened with Salvan was that he was living in Azerbaijan and he disagreed with the government, and as a result of that he was imprisoned after calling for protests against the government on Facebook. And Amnesty International would describe him as a prisoner of conscience, as he wasn't hurting anyone, just didn't agree with the government. And that's where the argument comes, like, where does harm stop, if it's physical harm or whether it's just verbal harm. And the fact was, he wasn't really harming someone, he was just expressing how he should feel, and so that gave him the right to be able to troll one another. As we saw in the definition of trolling, it is the purpose of annoying someone rather than hurting someone. And so he was just annoying the government and allowing people to be influenced into what he was saying and to follow him. And so that shows that it wasn't really creating no physical harm, so he should have been allowed to continue with what he was doing without the consequence of imprisonment. So the role of the internet also shows and supports that freedom of speech implies our freedom to troll one another, simply because it does bring out benefits that does end up in good results. So, example, the internet's regarded as a censorship-free zone where people can post whatever they want, and so that allows us to look at people's views, look at people's perspectives, look at new news, and be able to cooperate and see many different views and have that live debate, live discussion online with many people on an international level. It's also known to disrupt traditional power over free speech. An example of this again is China and North Korea. So these are places that may be under either dictatorship or strong authority over a leader, and the internet plays a part in almost downplaying that power by allowing free speech to seep in through these small accesses of the internet, and to allow people to argue back and discuss things that are being censored and raise them up to the point where traditional people who are in power can no longer really control people in that state. An aspect of that, an example of that, is Rahaf Mohammed Al Qunan, which is currently the Saudi Arabian teen that was granted asylum in Canada. So that attracted international attention, And even though it wasn't necessarily trolling, it can be regarded as trolling, because even though trolling is to annoy someone, a synonym of annoy is also disturb. And she basically disturbed people on the internet by constantly posting on Twitter, as she escaped from Saudi to Bangkok, that she was there in Bangkok, and she wanted to get asylum in either Australia or somewhere else, because she couldn't go back to Saudi because of the strong rules that they had there. As a result, that created the hashtag Save Rahaf, and it resulted in the UN noticing that she was a legitimate refugee because she was renounced to Islam, and you can be punished by death because of that. And she was also arrested. She could be arrested for disobeying her father. And so as a result of that, trolling does have its benefits, as once it's received media attention and attention of people across the world and on an international level, to the point where it's in people's faces constantly, it allows people to act upon that and create an outcome for it, rather than to ignore the situation. Miss Ben Meni, the Tunisian girl who also blogged on human rights under the regime of Ben Ali, and resulted in her equipment confiscated, and was also a benefit to Tunisia as well, because as a result, Ben Ali ended up toppled, especially as he sought to hold on to power by banning Facebook and Twitter. And that shows just how much, when you get to the internet and you constantly throw something in people's faces, it can have a positive outcome as well as just a negative. And so this brings us on to the counter argument that freedom of speech doesn't imply our freedom to troll one another. And this is seen by the need for safe places, the current discussion and debate, which is especially high in America, on whether we should have safe places and should the internet become one too. This has also been seen since the recent R. Kelly documentary that has been aired in America about his sexual abuse to young minors and young girls. And this basically creates the argument that if we get rid of these things and avoid them, we can restrict the amount of discussion that's placed on them and make people feel safe in living life on how they want to live it. However, if we do restrict these discussions, we might also restrict the outcome of the possibility of having a positive outcome or awareness to these things, and allowing people to have the discussion to then be able to place action upon them. However, there are known to be characters who do take trolling out of hand, such as Milo Yiannopoulos, who is a critic of Islam, atheism, feminism, and political correctness. And due to things that he has said on Twitter, he resulted in a ban because he violated Twitter's harassment and speech codes. However, some would argue that as Twitter is not really a government, do they have the absolute right to tell people what they can and can't say? However, Amnesty International did quote that governments have obligation to prohibit hate speech and incitement, and can also be justified if they protect specific public interest or the rights and reputations of others, but this must be set out in laws. However, as Twitter are just a private company who just have their own rules and regulations, it creates a question of how much can they restrict if they're not exactly a government, and showing that they are protecting the state rather than just the community of people in that website. Another example is also the current debate of pro-Brexit protesters and where the boundaries of free speech now lie, as this was seen the other day, especially last week in the second week of January, where pro-Brexit protesters were outside Parliament whilst Anna Salisbury, the pro-European MP, was being interviewed, and they were shouting Salisbury as a Nazi. And this was also seen in 2017 as well, during the Scottish independence, where there was a banner that said "Hang the Tories." This shows that sometimes these are threats of violence and threats of harm, and threats where you're accusing somebody of something that can result in physical harm to that person because of what you are calling them, what you're addressing to them. And so, again, that shows that it doesn't imply our freedom to troll one another, as it can result in harm being brought to a person. This further encourages the debate between liberal minimalism, where we should focus on rights, but then also on deliberative democracy, where there is a debate needed, but ground rules should be applied. And personally, I believe that deliberate democracy should be the basis on where freedom of speech lies, simply because we need ground rules to show that people can't go as far as making threats of violence, but they should be allowed to express how they feel and their certain views on a topic. So this brings us on to our conclusion, where I agree that freedom of speech on the internet implies our freedom to troll one another to a certain extent. I agree with Mill's approach that if it doesn't inflict physical harm, it should be allowed. However, I also agree with Ash that threats of violence and death threats should have consequences for an individual and should be prohibited by law. Threats of violence can constitute harm and they can class as physical harm due to the fact that can be the end result. I believe that that should be banned on the web, and I also believe that when it comes to trolling, it's down to the individual to deal with the consequence of what they result in, of the consequence that they have to deal with. And I also believe that deliberative democracy is a suitable method to apply to a freedom of speech ground rule, simply because we do need to have these discussions about matters that affect us internationally, affect people individually as well. And if we restrict everything, then how can we raise awareness about a situation? How can we help people if there can be a positive outcome to a situation? And how can we promote something that can benefit the world as a whole? Presentation done. Thank you for listening.